Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Hello, welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm Beth Parker and your moderator for this evening. The Ethical Perspectives Committee meets to determine topics for discussion, and they are topics that shape the decisions that we make and topics that impact our lives. So when I selected voter suppression, I thought, oh, this is going to be easy peasy, but that was not the case. So in fact, the topic voter suppression is nuanced, it's emotional, and it's dynamic. I found myself asking, who are we as Americans? Are we a country of people who comprehend the power of coexistence, of diversity and inclusion? Or are we better described as a national conglomeration of self-interest limited by yesteryear's founders and guidelines? We try to present topics and panelists of variant perspectives. So related to voting issues, and because of his influence and experience, I did reach out to the Secretary of State. He was unable to accommodate. However, I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists. We have Professor Christina Bohannon from University of Iowa, Miss Rigby, Miss Birgy from Coe College, and of course Joel Miller, the auditor, Linn County Auditor. So let's just start with each of you saying a few words about yourself and why you withstood the tornado warnings and agreed to stay here and join us.
Start with me?
If you'd like.
Okay. So I'm a professor of law at the University of Iowa College of Law, and I teach constitutional law. And so I have a real professional interest, of course, in issues related to voter suppression and other things like that. But you know, just even as a citizen, I think I care a lot about it, because the truth is that no matter what issues you care about as a person, from tax policy to abortion to climate change, you know, everything depends on voters' voices being heard. I mean, every issue you care about really comes down to the vote. And you know, we live in a really diverse, pluralistic society, and the fact is that I think sometimes, honestly, the only thing that keeps us from killing each other over some of these political issues is the idea that if we lose, we lost in a fair election. Mm-hmm. And I think that I worry about what happens if we can't say that anymore, if people lose confidence in the election system to resolve our differences. So I think it's just a critical issue for our society.
Rose.
I'm a first-year international studies student at Coe College, and mine is more of a personal interest just because this will be my first year that I'll be able to vote in elections, and additionally, as an out-of-state student, there's more of a process to go through, per se, and I'm also just very interested in this structure of voting that is seen to be, you know, the greatest American duty, and who is able to actually participate and contribute their voice to that, and who is denied that right.
I've been the Linn County Auditor and Commissioner of Elections for 12 plus years, and I've been striving to increase voter turnout since I was elected in 2007, and I feel like I have a vested interest in it. Now my interest is in the security of the election. I have concerns about the security of the voter records that are held in our voter registration system. That is the vulnerability. That is the number one target for anyone wanting to do harm to our election process. Mm-hmm. Because if you can undermine the integrity of the election, if you can somehow manipulate voter records that are in the system, and now you have created a distrust of the system, and therefore a distrust of the outcome of the results of the election. So that's my number one concern right now, and that didn't exist before 2016. That was not something that we thought about as election officials, but it is now, and it's in the forefront, and very concerned and very attentive to what we should be doing, what needs to be done.
Agreed, very important. Let me direct a question to you, Rose. There was a recent Gazette article entitled Voting Restrictions Under Fire, which identified proposals that would subject college students who vote in the state to certain restricted their requirements for voting registrations. That certainly seems to have struck a chord with many young people. What are your thoughts about that, or your peers generally?
Well, definitely as a young person, I think we're all eager to vote, and especially at this day and age, there's lots of important issues to be discussed that I think the youth perspective tends to be slightly different from those of the voting generations who've had that power for a significantly longer part of their life. And I think the process of registering to vote and of actually voting, it's this thing that everyone tells you, like, oh, you must, this is your civic duty. But I think it is a very confusing process, and especially when it comes to the requirements of, you know, what form of ID you have to present, you know, how many days in advance you need to register or have lived in the district in which you're going to be voting for. There's the entire idea of should you be voting an absentee ballot for your original place of residence if you're an out-of-state student versus voting for the state you're currently living in. And those have just been added things that you need to think about, and additional kind of, I don't want to say barriers, but kind of thresholds to meet and to, you know, kind of jump over. So yeah, me, myself, I was registered to vote in Minnesota, and so I transferred my voting to locally because this is the place I'll be living in for the next 4 years and possibly longer. But the process, you know, no one really ever tells you that much about it. So on campus, I definitely think people have been, you know, bringing in not only just the political campaigns to keep us educated, but also the ability to register on campus and to also, you know, change your registration for if you were originally registered to vote in a different district. So I think that has been helping bring awareness. But there's still sort of you don't necessarily know what's going on behind the scenes, and, you know, double checking to make sure, yes, I am registered to vote here, that was, you know, changed for me versus just being a person who's voted and is already in the records, coming forward to vote.
So just picking up on some of the things we discussed at dinner, I know that Auditor Miller and also Christina, Professor Bohannon, we were talking about, you know, the effort to include young people in the vote, how important it is and why it's a passion. I think you both are hitting it from different angles. Yeah.
Well, I think younger people need to vote because then the elected officials, myself included, will pay more attention to the issues that are of concern to the younger people. And I think we've got to see that. Yes, the turnout for that age group was, to the younger voters, was higher, I think, in 2018. I think it resulted in some wins by one political party over the other. But it needs to be more reflective of the total population that people say from 18 to 29 comprise in our population. And we know that's the next generation that is going to be making decisions for us. So we need to get them involved, and they need to show their numbers, and they need to vote for candidates to represent their views, and then start running candidates from their age group, and then start changing things, changing legislation, becoming the people that are in control of the legislative bodies throughout the city council or board of supervisors or state or federal. I mean, those are the kinds of things that need to happen, and why everyone, not just the young people, but everyone needs to be involved.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Bohannon, you know, coming to us by way of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Montgomery, Alabama. You have some passion for this issue too, and we were talking a little bit about it.
I do, yeah. I mean, you know, I'm really encouraged by young people's interest in politics and in voting and in voter rights. I think it's fantastic. I think they have a lot more time to live on this earth and in this country now than I do, or any of us, and so absolutely they should make their voices heard. And I think it's a huge mistake when politicians don't listen to them or try to marginalize them in some way by reducing their window for, I think there's this window before you turn 18 of when you can register and those kinds of things, or whether it's, there was this attempt to take the voting sites that were on state university campuses off. Unfortunately, that was blocked. But we need to be encouraging young people to vote, not discouraging them. We need to make it easier, not harder. And they're right now. They're at a point where if they're excited about this, this is going to set their habits for the future, and we need to make that easier. We need to really encourage that and reinforce that rather than making it more difficult.
And is that something you're able to incorporate in your classes? Or is the law profession something completely different? How are you?
Well, certainly I think I would say that in my classes, I would say people probably do come out of them thinking it's really important for them to be involved and to vote because they see all of the issues that arise. They see what's at stake throughout history, really, in terms of, especially constitutional law, but in other areas of law as well, tort law, in anything like that, there are issues there, and so absolutely, I think that they realize how important that is, and they also see threats to the right to vote, and I think they really get a sense of the unfairness of some of that. And so one of the things that you and we had talked about at dinner was the gerrymandering issue, and I think that's Joel talked about the election security, and I think gerrymandering to me is one of the most important issues that we're facing right now, because frankly, over the summer, the Supreme Court abdicated its constitutional responsibility when it comes to partisan gerrymandering. The Chief Justice Roberts' opinion for the majority had one of the saddest statements in it I have ever seen in a Supreme Court decision. He said the fact that partisan gerrymandering is incompatible with democratic principles does not mean that the solution lies in the judiciary. So he acknowledged fully that partisan gerrymandering is anti-democratic, but said that it wasn't up to the court to do anything about it. Yeah. And there is nothing more central to the court's responsibility than preserving our democratic form of government or our individual fundamental constitutional right to vote.
Well, we're going to get you up on the Supreme Court then. That's right. It was interesting. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that what happened there is the court was afraid. The court was afraid to wade into these politics. But if you look at our constitutional history, we see that the court has done that over and over, going all the way back to and including Marbury versus Madison, which was a huge political fight. And the court does that when it's necessary to preserve our democracy and our rule of law. And the court said there were no judicially manageable standards, but the dissent clearly showed that there are. And so this was not an issue of no judicial standards. This was an issue of no judicial courage. And I think this was a bad moment for the Roberts Court, and I think that history will not be kind to this decision.
Well, it's interesting to me that one of the topics that came up was about how we tend to become so polarized, and a lot of your focus is on getting two parties to talk to each other. We can't make any kind of progress if we're sitting in our little igloos and not conversing. Say a little bit about the importance of speaking above issues that polarize.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think that law school is really conducive to this, because in law school, you have to argue both sides. I mean, in class and in assignments, you don't know which side you're going to be assigned sometimes. You're just given this side, and you have to do your best with it, even if you disagree with it. And so professionally, this is just part of what we have to do. And so in my classes, I really encourage students to debate both sides. And one thing I tell them that's helpful is I say, don't take this as someone's personal view. Make the argument on that side. And what that does is, not only does that force them to learn legal skills of argument, but I think it actually creates a little bit of empathy for the other side, because you're now having to make their best argument, and sometimes the first person you have to convince is yourself, And so I think that it at least it frees people up to talk about these different issues, and also may create a little bit of understanding, or the beginnings of it at least.
A shift in perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I can see where he's coming from. That's critical. So we understand that record numbers of people voted in the 2018 midterms and are anticipated to vote in 2020. But as we drive people to the polls, we also become aware of, you know, the gerrymandering decision and the recently different components of voter registration, of blocking voter registrations. You know, the incidents in Georgia with Stacey Abrams. So if we keep driving people to the polls, how do we get them to, how do we convince them that it's worth it? You know, well, my vote's not going to count, or they move the polling place, or I don't have the documents that I need.
Well, we have to have faith in the system. We have to trust the system. We have to trust that the results, you know, reflect who the electorate voted for, that the winners won, and that the losers accept the result. I mean, that's how we transition power in this country, is through elections, from one election to the next. So I think we have to continue to inform people, to let them know their vote matters, that it can make a difference, that it's not wasted when they vote, and that you know, and they need to see that when people are elected, that it truly does make some difference in their life. And I think you see that more with local officials that are elected than you necessarily may on the state or federal level. But the fact of it is, it all works together. And so, you know, we have to ensure the integrity of the elections and make sure that that's not ever compromised.
So that brings a couple of things to mind. Do we trust the system?
I think it changes by the day. I think in the present day, for young people, I think the general perspective is one of just pessimism. No matter like where you're coming from, it just seems like the world is not ignoring so many things, but disregarding them, and the priorities are very interesting. But I think there's also optimism for when the next generation of voters is able to vote, and when we're able to run for office and see how us observing what's going on now in the present administration will affect our decisions in the future. So it's a mix of a great potential, but also just, you know, wondering if the repercussions of what is happening today will be too great for us to overcome later.
Are you motivated to run for something? Would you ever be?
I go back and forth about it.
Okay.
I feel like it's a lot of responsibility that I, you know, would wish I was able to take on, but I also think I may be better suited to supporting others who are, who I see as being better equipped and more charismatic, possibly. Just, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. So, Professor Bohannon, but you said that you're encouraged by the youth of today, and that it's.
I am. I mean, there's a lot wrong right now. I mean, I will be the first to say that, and I worry about it. I think we need to take money out of politics. I think that we need to, you know, think about the inequities in our society, which are growing. I think that there are all kinds of problems that we need to deal with. On the other hand, I will say that I see some encouraging signs. When I see what's been going on, I see that some of the responses, you know, people are not becoming more apathetic. People are becoming more engaged. That is fundamentally a very healthy sign for a democracy. People have not given up. And so I think that's super important. And so if you look at the record turnout in the 2018 election, the people who ran, more women, more people of color, openly gay people running in traditionally conservative states and winning. We're seeing all kinds of positive signs in that regard. We're seeing increased media scrutiny. And the other thing that I think is really important that we're starting to see, but we need a lot more of it, is attention to what we're talking about right here. And that is not just talking about the current social issues of the day, but these longer run democratic rule of law type issues. And those are sometimes not talked about as much because they're longer term concerns.
Explain.
And so, well, So politicians, a lot of times, you know, their representatives are usually only in for 2 years. Even senators are only in for 6 years. And so I think their incentives are for more quick wins and the sexy topics. You know, the things that are, you know, that are right in front of people today. You know, the abortion issue, or you know, something like that. It's why climate change has been such an issue, because the harms have been viewed as such long-term, kind of far out harms, and so no politician who's only going to be in for a few years has that much incentive to do that much about it, because the harm is not going to be felt by his constituents during this voting cycle. And so that's really a concern, and I think the same is largely true for some of these democracy, voter suppression type issues, because they are longer run concerns for our democracy as a whole. And so, you know, I think that getting the word out there, raising public awareness about these kinds of voter issues is really, really important. And the more people understand that that's what really underlies all of these other issues that we're talking about, I think the better success we'll have in solving some of these issues.
Aren't we supposed to be bigger than that? Bigger than ourselves? I mean, we're supposed to look outside ourselves and look down the road and watch out for our grandkids? And
absolutely, absolutely. And I think we're starting to see, I heard someone say this today, the little green shoots coming out of the ground. I think we're starting to see maybe just a little bit of that, and those little green shoots give me hope.
Auditor Miller, so one thing that I learned is that states are independently charged with setting voter laws. Talk a little bit about that and the interaction between the state and the federal government.
Well, the states are in charge of the election laws, with very few exceptions. Certainly there are some federal laws that can be enforced for violations of elections, but by and large the elections are run by the state and then by local election officials like me. So 99 county auditors in Iowa, and we administer all the elections for our counties. So there's this interaction right now that's occurring on the federal level with cybersecurity and everything that came out of the 2016 efforts by the Russians to hack into systems. And we know that Iowa was a target, and we know that 2 counties in Iowa were a target. But what I don't know is which 2 counties, and that kind of exemplifies what the issue is. And that is that while the federal agencies may have the intelligence and they may share that with 1 or 2 people at the state level, that information never gets down to people like me. So I don't know why Iowa was targeted, for example. I don't know why 2 counties in Iowa were targeted. And so I can't learn from, if there were errors and issues or omissions or whatever, I can't even learn from them because I don't have the security clearance to be privy to that information. And this isn't just Iowa, this is across the country that this is happening, where the feds are maybe sharing it with a limited number of people at the state level, and local officials like me across the country are not getting the information. So we don't, you know, it's one of those, we don't know what we don't know what to protect against. What I call it is I have to kind of take a shotgun effect to everything. I have to try to plug any holes that I hear about. I have to try to get educated on it. And I have an IT background, but most of my peers don't. And so we have people with backgrounds that are not in technology, basically in charge of cybersecurity and hoping that people at the state level are protecting us. And yet we know that the state is limited by funding and resources and so forth to do that. So that's where we need more communication. I mean, it's happened at the federal level. It might be happening a little bit at the state level, but how do I protect things? I do my best, but I don't know what the Chinese. I mean, we're facing a nation-state actors here, whether it be the Chinese or the Russians or the North Koreans or the Iranians. There's a lot of people in the world that want to do harm to us, and they do it by attacking us at the local level where the elections are actually administered.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about collateral damage related to voting security. I know that all of us have talked about the issue of felons being reinstated. Is it ethical to withhold voting rights when a felon has served their time? I mean, it almost seems as though we're saying, well, yeah, you paid your dues, but wait a minute, not quite. Mm-hmm. Why? I mean, anybody care to take off on that? Yeah.
Well, I feel like we're expecting felons to reintegrate into society in every single aspect and contribute back to the community and to the nation, except for in the one thing that's considered to be, like, you know, our greatest civic duty and the factor that also decides who represents us. And the fact that we allow, we expect felons to reintegrate fully back into society and into the working community, but we don't allow them to have that representation, I think is fundamentally not ethical.
Flawed.
I agree. I mean, I agree 100%. And you know that if we want people to act like upstanding members of society, we have to treat them like that. We can't we can't be telling them in sort of subtle and not so subtle ways, you know, you're not worth voting in our system, and then and still expect them to act with that self-respect that comes from being an upstanding citizen. And the fact is, you know, Iowa is one of the 12 most severe states when it comes to giving back felons. We don't. I mean, Joel can talk more to this because he has this letter that you sent out, which I think is really interesting. But you know, we really are one of the most strict. We're in the 12 kind of strictest categories, you know, in terms of, you know, what we give. And so I think that that's something that we really need to rethink. And the other thing that we need to think about is that, you know, in Iowa, the term in the Constitution is that, you know, that felons who have committed infamous crimes don't have their voting rights. Well, that's been interpreted to mean all felonies. But there are things that are felonies that are not violent crimes. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that we would, you know, tell somebody that they lose their right to vote forever because they distributed marijuana, for example, which is a felony in Iowa, just seems really, I do think that that's unethical. I think when we're talking about crimes that are technically felonies, but that are not violent in any way, and then to say that you're going to lose your voting rights and your right to kind of contribute to society and be a part of our democratic community is unethical.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's unethical and immoral for felons not to be allowed to vote after they've done their time in prison, period. Mm-hmm. That said, I'm an elected official and I took an oath of office and I have to administer the election laws, but I find it hard to swallow when felons who vote, some through no fault of their own, or they should have checked, they should have done a lot of things, but they vote and they get prosecuted, and they did violate the law. When you have another 20 or 30% of the population that didn't bother to vote, depending upon which election it is, it could be way more than that didn't vote. So we're prosecuting people who voted. Yes, they shouldn't have voted, and then you have a lot of other people that aren't even engaged in anything that aren't voting, and that's a shame that happens.
Really, a very important issue. We're running out of time, so I think we can just keep discussing and let them tune us out whenever they need to, but I'm so grateful to our panelists. And additional resources might include the League of Women Voters, the National Committee for Voting Integrity, the Election Integrity Project, and your office, and Valerie Smith, of course, who does a lot of work. So thank you for participating, everyone, and we're going to close with that information.